Hello. Hello to everyone here today for the More Than the Hero's Quest panel at YALLWrite 2020. I'm so excited to be here today to talk about story structure with some amazing authors. We all learn in school kind of the basic way that you have to tell a story, right? Exposition, rising action, climax, resolution. But that is not the only way to tell a story. And I cannot wait to dive into some of the other ways and the other things, the uses and misuses of story structure that we find in our work and how we deploy story structure as one of the many tools that writers have. We are going to get to all of those topics and more with the four writers we have here today, who I'm going to allow to introduce themselves in a moment and tell us about their latest work and anything else they want to say about this glorious year 2020 and its plotlessness. Where are the murder hornets? That seems like a structural flaw in the storytelling. And there will be time for questions. So if you have questions as you are hearing these brilliant authors talk, ask them, and I will try and pepper your questions in throughout. And at the end, we will have time for more questions. So have your questions ready about story structure. But let's start us off. If we could meet our authors, let's go with Tracy. Will you introduce yourself and your amazing works?
I knew it was going to be me. I just felt it. Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Dionne. I am the author of Legendborn. That's my debut novel, the first in a series. It's a contemporary fantasy about a 16-year-old girl who is infiltrating a secret society on a college campus because she believes that they may know something about her mother's mysterious death. And then they reveal they are the descendants of the Knights of the Round Table. Surprise! Complications ensue. And then just recently, this week, From a Certain Point of View, The Empire Strikes Back Anthology was released. And I have a story in there where I give a life perspective and an exploration of the Force through the eyes of the cave on Dagobah. And I'm working on book 2 and other weird magical stuff.
Amazing. Lindsay.
Hey, I am Lindsay Bandy, and I am author of Nemesis and the Swan. That's my debut YA historical, and it takes place at the height of the French Revolution. So, real similar to 2020, all the chaos and whatnot. But it's the story of Helene, and she is in a prison cell awaiting her fate to find out if she's going to live through the night as the mob is surrounding this prison. And she's remembering the events that led her there and still trying to unravel the mystery of her own family.
Great. Roseanne?
Hi, everyone. I'm Roseanne A. Brown. I'm the author of A Song of Rapes and Ruin, so shiny. And it's set in a world inspired by West African folklore, and it follows two protagonists, a princess named Karina and a refugee named Malik. So when Malik's younger sister is kidnapped by a vengeful spirit, he strikes a deal that to win her freedom, he must kill Karina, the princess of the realm. So he enters a competition for her hand in marriage to kill her. However, what he doesn't know is Karina's mother has just been assassinated, and she's discovered a forbidden spell that will bring her back to life, but she has to sacrifice her husband to do it. So she set up this competition to find some dude, marry him, and then kill him to get her mother back to life. So she's trying to kill him, he's trying to kill her, neither of them know it. And the book is about the way things kind of go off the rails when they meet each other and realize they have a lot more in common than they wish they did.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Neal.
Hi, I'm Neal Shusterman, and I'm the author of a bunch of books: Unwind, the Arc of a Scythe trilogy, Dry, and my upcoming book, which is coming out in February, is called Game Changer. And that's about a high school football player whose tackles are so hard that he bounces into alternate universes. And in the course of these alternate universes that he finds himself in, he has to deal with issues of identity and racism and look at his life and the world in ways that he never looked at them before.
And I feel lucky that I'm one of the few people in the world who's read it already, or at least a version of it. And structurally, yes, you were playing at a different level. Structure. I cannot imagine how you managed that novel. I want to hear more about that. We learn a lot. I feel like the Joseph Campbell's monomyth, the hero's quest, like hangs heavy over the way we learn how to write, the way we tell stories, the way we think about stories. But there are so many other ways that don't aren't Eurocentric, don't center cis, white, straight storytelling. And I'd love to explore how in your own work you've managed, or because I think you all do it in really interesting ways, to play with that monomyth, to break it apart, to not do those things, or to do them deliberately and aware of what they are. Does anyone want to talk about how you have grappled with the structuring of your story based on the stories we've inherited as writers?
I can start.
I always have a tendency.
Yeah, Neal, you can go, and then Tracy. Was that
Neal.
Tracy?
Yeah. Okay. I always have a tendency when I'm told this is how you do it, to do it the opposite way. I'm just always naturally contrary when it comes to that. And so I'm always trying to sort of break the mold of, what they say works, and try to find a new way to make a story work. Whether it's telling a story in different order, or not having the inciting incident at the right place, and many things will always fall into a beginning, middle, and end format. That's sort of that 3-act structure naturally. But there's so many variations within that you can play with.
Yeah, Tracy?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, how I think the Wizard of Earthsea and Star Wars were the examples that were given to me in like middle school of like, this follows exactly the hero's journey. And, it's got the wise old man character, and here, there's a mirror of self and all this stuff. And I remember when I was really sitting down to start working on my own novel, my first novel, I was like, thinking about story in terms of plot points only is how you get into trouble, because you end up with these books that are just events after events after events. And then I feel like that sets us up as writers to be casting our protagonist in the way of conflict, rather than the protagonist being active in creating conflict and their agency and choices mattering. So I really feel like I had to unlearn the plot by plot like plot point by plot point structure. And it's a thing that if you are starting out trying to get published, you'll hear it even from editors and from agents, like, just don't throw this protagonist from like event to event like a pinball. Like, I want to know how they got there, why it mattered. And then I sort of realized that as long as I could convince my reader and myself that this person, that we care deeply about this person and we understood their decisions, readers will kind of go with you wherever. Like, if those two things are true, then things can be in all sorts of orders.
Roseanne, have you found that?
Yes, definitely. And for like me personally, I sort of come from a background of my family's from Ghana, so I grew up with oral storytelling. And the way you tell a story orally is so just naturally different than how you tell a story like that's only meant to be written. And that was something that I wanted to recreate in my work, the idea of a story that's told to you. And one thing I was learning as I was diving into sort of oral storytelling techniques and why these techniques have sort of passed down for so long was, and I was looking into the monomyth, I was reading this one book, The Hero with the African Face, which was about breaking down like so many African epics and stories, but like through a more literary lens. And what the author, the theory he presented is this idea that the reason the monomyth shows up so often is not because it's this literal structure that all these cultures are using, because that's not true, but because it's more of a metaphor, like the idea that the monomyth represents the journey from birth to death. And when you start seeing it then as a metaphor for how a life moves, it starts making more sense why it keeps on coming through again and again. And so when you start applying it emotionally to your plot and not literally, you open up so many more avenues for how you can move your story and how you can take your character through that birth to death journey, even if they don't actually born at the start, they don't die at the start. Without actually, you could have an entire book set in the same exact room and still follow the monomyth, which is why I feel like the way we teach it in classes can be very reductive when we tell students to like follow it literally. So that's kind of where I am with that.
And Lindsay, writing historical, I imagine presents a different challenge because history has no plot in a way.
Right,
How do you grapple with
right.
that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, placing a character in a historical timeline, those big events are given to you by history, but those are not necessarily my plot points because I'm looking at a very character-driven story. So my plot points, if I think about it that way, are really when I feel the story turn for the character on the inside. And instead of looking at, well, this is when they need to meet their mentor, and this is when they need to enter the deep, dark cave, and blah, 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 it's like, I think about it more as a rhythm of, about every 25% marker, I need to feel that story shift, and I need to feel my character shift, and kind of go in a different direction to be showing that growth. And so when I was writing Nemesis and the Swan, we're starting out just as the revolution is beginning. At the 25% mark, that's right around where Helene has her family's chateau set on fire and she's forced to run away. It's a fictional event, that it was based in history, but it shifts her story in a new direction, but it also is shifting her development in a new direction. So I kind of like to look at those quarters, just to make sure the rhythm is moving, but then I go back and forth in time within those and do all kinds of things. But that kind of just helps me to stay accountable that the story is not getting stagnant.
So let me ask a less heady question of all of you.
Okay.
On a practical sense, in a very like writerly, like what you do every day sense, thinking about structure, do you outline? Do you actually plan the structures? Do you use the labels? Do you do like, oh, this is the inciting incident. This is the, Tracy, you mentioned a love, but what we were talking before of the word denouement. Or was that Roseanne? Who loved denouement?
That was me, denouement. I love
Tracy, Tracy.
Do you actually label it? Here we go. Here's the denouement. How do you plan your structure?
I outline. Yeah, I outline. But here's the thing that I've discovered, which is critical for me, is that I can only outline about 1/8 of the book at a time. So I generally know, I almost always know the ending chapter and the ending image, and sometimes I can write the last chapter about 25% of the way through the book. I generally write linearly, but I do know that last chapter. And then I generally know the middle, sort of what you would call the midpoint. And I have a few big scenes that I know are going to shift a relationship or a dynamic or whatever. But I write 1/8 of the book, and then I pause and like kind of like a meerkat. Like I pop up, I look around, and I'm like, where are we actually? Where are these characters emotionally? Let's be real with yourself, Tracy. Did that person get where you thought they were going to go? And like, would they actually do this next thing? And then I re-outline like the next little bit, and I'll go back. And sometimes it's a recursive process. Well, I'll go back and say, okay, wait a second. Now we need to shift. But I made the mistake of outlining a whole book one time, and I will never do that again, because it just, all the surprises and all the good stuff, would have been lost if I had followed it.
How about the others?
I definitely take a look at those plot points, the first plot point, the midpoint, and the third one. And I sketch those out before I start to write, because I'm a pantser, and I know that if I don't have those markers for myself, I will go off the rails and I won't have a story. I'll have like a freestyle poem. So I have those in mind.
Can you just define what a pantser is for those who might not know?
You write by the seat of your pants. You sit down and you let the magic come out of your fingers. You don't know what's going to happen. You're not an outliner, and I'm definitely not. Even in high school, I wrote the outline after I wrote the paper because I just couldn't do it. But I will keep those major points in mind, but everything's allowed to be flexible. I am a stretchy pantser. The pants can move, with me, but I try to just keep that in mind and make sure that I have that overall arc, basically in front of me, so I don't lose track of my thoughts.
Neal, I've always pictured you as someone who would do like amazing outlines, but no?
Well, I like to start with an outline in my head. I mean, I'll try to see the story playing like a movie in my head from beginning to end. I'll do pages where I just pose questions to myself. What does this character want? How will they know that they've achieved it? What happens when these two characters meet? And it's basically just asking questions to myself. And as I answer the questions, the story starts to develop. But most of the inspiration for a story doesn't come before you start it. Most of the inspiration comes while you're writing it, and you have those aha moments. If you plot it out too much, I find that you miss those aha moments because you're so focused on following the plot that you had. So, I mean, what I basically say is I I trick myself into thinking that I know where the story's going, because in the course of writing it, it's always changing. But sometimes, in order to feel comfortable sitting down and actually writing, I have to believe I know I have a story and I know where it's going to go, but it never goes exactly where I think it's going to go. But in order to get myself going, I have to trick myself into thinking that I know.
And Roseanne, writing, epic with world building and all of those things. You don't go in with like a rigid plan.
So I've kind of become notorious with my editor that like I will write an outline and then I will never follow it. And so like every time I'll be like, okay, this is what we're doing. And then she gets a completely different book that I told her that we were doing. And this has happened like maybe 4 times now, because I need to write something out, but I also I never feel obligated to follow whatever I wrote. For me, it's more important that I kind of have the emotional arc down, and I know like this is a character who's going from a journey from being unsure of himself to sure of himself, or a girl who's learning to claim her own power, or sort of that more general sketch. And then from there, the plot points, I think I know what's gonna happen, and then every time like future Rosie comes back, she's like, maybe not. And so my dear sweet editor, every time she's like, oh, I guess we're doing this now. That's great. But it's worked out, so.
So
you all write linearly. You don't write out of order?
Most of the time.
Yeah.
For me, I've always written linearly, except in the book Challenger Deep, where that was written all over the place. And it took more than 4 years to write because it was very different for me, and it was a different process and a different result in terms of how the story was told. And that's I did that intentionally because I didn't want it to flow like a regular story. I wanted it to sort of be puzzle pieces that you put together. And so that was a challenge, not writing linearly.
And how did you know that the story demanded that nonlinear structure? This is a question from the audience, really, is how you know when a story demands non-traditional.
I think every story, part of the storytelling is knowing the structure and how you're going to tell it. And figuring that out is half the battle. Because Challenger Deep was about mental illness, was about schizophrenia, I felt that it needed to have a schizophrenic feel to it. And I felt the best way to accomplish that was to be nonlinear in my approach of writing it.
Another question from the audience, specifically for Roseanne. FD wants to know if you can quickly explain a few ways that oral storytelling conventions differ from the hero's quest. And they add, as a fellow Ghanaian, I'd love to know more. So,
hey, Ghana. But okay, so I think the most important thing to always remember with oral storytelling is obviously it's a call and a response. Like even traditionally, like a story starts with like, we see this in so many African cultures, African diaspora, the idea that your story, like you see, like you put a call to audience, like the story is beginning and they call back. So you're working with a back and forth, you're working off what's happening. Of course, that's not something you can 100% recreate with a written medium just by nature. And so there's this idea that you always have to kind of focus in on what is most engaging in that moment. And the idea of looking at a scene and thinking not necessarily what is going to be like, how do I present this in the way that's going to have the prettiest prose, or it's even not necessarily the best visually, but how do I present this scene in a way that the reader, is going to have the most emotion coming from it. And this idea that like this reader is going to be engaged. And that means sometimes focusing in on the details that don't necessarily come across as the most apparent to you at the first try. Like there were definitely several revisions where I was going through rates and I was shifting scenes, like not necessarily changing what was happening, but shifting the way I focused on it to bring the reader more into the moment and to bring them there and to really kind of keep that cadence going. And another thing super important with oral storytelling is the idea that like the words aren't always like grammatically correct. They're not always 100% standard, perfect, like what we're taught is the correct English, quote unquote. Because when you're speaking, there's always pauses, there's dips, there's like words that run together. This idea that one thing I tried to do was also even recreating with the actual paragraph length, page length, like making the page look like it was how a person would speak rather than how prose should necessarily look on the page. Like this idea that I really want the book to feel like something that is being read to the reader. And so I'm bringing that into how I would then create the story then with this idea that like, if this is meant to emulate a spoken narrative, then the onus should always be on the words to kind of like hold that in the reader's head, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So Tracy, you mentioned Wizard of Earthsea, and our reader Nicole mentions something that I really wanted to talk about. Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction. The theory being that the first human invention was not the spear, it was the satchel, it was the vessel to carry things in, and that storytelling, a challenge of storytelling, is to find a way to carry a jumble of things together, rather than something driven towards a sort of fatal point. I'm not describing it terribly well, but that question of how do you tell a story that instead of being purely plot driven can be this collection of things, can be communal, maybe doesn't have a single hero or single pivot points for the plot, but has a community as hero. Has that idea informed any of the work that you all do, especially telling stories with multiple characters, with multiple goals, with multiple intersecting communities? Heavy questions, I know, for a Friday evening.
Yeah. I feel like I have an answer, but I don't know if it's directly related to my work, but it is related to how I grew up hearing stories. And I think that the thing about oral traditions, and I'm from the South, and so I think like my experience of being around like a family reunion or family with Black folks in the South and telling you might hear the same story a bunch of times, but so much of what's important is the meta, is the person telling you that story. And there can be these moments where you're getting commentary about the story, and the commentary might take as long as the actual story. And the emphasis, the takeaway being that the person who's speaking out loud is just as much a part of this experience as the fictional imagined, tale. And that me being here with them is me being a part of the story as well. So I do think that there's this sort of wonderful aspect to that type of folklore style telling where you're hearing the commentary about the thing, and that you're getting a footnote, but verbally, so that enriches the story. And then like my father used to do this, and then we'd come back to the actual story and be like, okay, not back to the story, but you'd feel like that was part of it, that like the diversion was part of it, and that now I was getting it through a new way. But then of course the best thing is when you're in a setting like that and then you hear someone else say, that's not how it went, and then you get that. And those moments, I think, helped me think of stories not belonging to one person.
Did you find ways to use that within Legendborn?
Absolutely, actually. So a lot of what Legendborn is a mystery, which I didn't realize until like a year and a half into writing it, by the way. And I was like, oh, I'm writing a mystery. But part of why it's a mystery is because people have the main character doesn't have information. She's looking for information, but also everyone around her has information that can easily be revealed as misinformation. And I think realizing that the truth is a collection of perspectives is really where Legendborn is going, like as a story commentary, that she's searching for the truth, and the truth means a lot of different things. And actually someone can say, this is the truth, this is what happened. And it is true. Simultaneously, it's not enough. Like there's more to it. So I think, yeah, I did get that into Legendborn a little bit.
Do you think the genre you're writing in influences the way you build your story? I mean, Lindsay writing historical, does that writing within a particular epoch, did that influence how you felt you had to tell the story, or how you were able to tell the story?
I kind of look at composing a story like composing music in a lot of ways. There are three basic elements of music theory when you think about song structure, and it's contrast, repetition, and continuity. And I think that those three things are what take music. If a kid sits down at the piano and plays a bunch of notes, it's music, but it's not a song. If I sit down and I write a bunch of scenes, it's writing, but it's not story. it's that back and forth of the contrast, the repetition, and the continuity. And so in Nemesis and the Swan, even though it's a historical novel, it goes back and forth in time from when she was little to when she's older, when she's in prison to when she was in Paris, and back and forth. So I think even with historical, you can play around with that because that's how people think. You know, we don't think in a straight line. We don't grow in a straight line. We don't grow and change in a set pattern. So I think about it more in the sense of music where, you feel those shifts, when you go into whether it's a pop song or a sonata, you feel a shift, whether it's, created in a key change or a rhythm change or adding instrumentation or taking it away. You need those shifts, which are the structure, so that your reader or your listener doesn't get bored. And just, thinking about as a listener for a story or for a song, you have a sense of when things should change, when things should pick up, and it's that kind of innate rhythm that I think, the contrast and the repetition working together can create that continuity. And a book like Midwinter Blood by Marcus Sedgwick, that's one of my favorite books, and it's 7 separate stories, but they all connect, and you have this back and forth contrast. It's not divided into 4 parts, it's divided into 7 parts, but it works, and it works because of those principles. And so I think, as I look at just, scene to scene, I'm thinking about that contrast. When is it time to switch? When does my reader feel like it's time for something else to happen? But making sure that you're creating the repetition that puts your character back in a similar situation, and then they can react differently and show that they've grown, and doing that as a whole. So I don't think that the historical aspect limits me at all. I think it just gives me some stuff to work with, and then you can play around with it all you want structurally.
Neal, that made me think about Game Changer and how you have this character who's living the same life with different perspectives throughout the story, and how the tension of those, there's a musicality to it, there's a rhythm, there's that push and pull as he experiences the same people in different ways. And did the rhythm of his story inform, like, is there sort of the way Lindsay was saying with the percents, do you have a feeling of that, or at this point in your career is it just sort of innate knowledge that you have?
Well, it's a story like Game Changer is a challenge because you're not only creating one world, you're creating a world, the character's discovering the world, and then you're pulling out the rug out from under that character and throwing that character into a world that is slightly different, or a world that is the same, but the character is different. And so there's so many different things that the character has to learn along the way, and the world start to build on one another. I mean, structurally, starts in our world, then he goes into a world where things are slightly different, but still remembers a previous world. And then in the third world, he still remembers the second and the first world, but now he's influenced by everything that's going on in this world. So it's sort of that layering upon layering upon layering was very challenging, and trying to keep it from being episodic. Because it's not like Quantum Leap where every chapter you're in a different world and you have a problem to solve, and you solve it, and then you're on to the next one. They're cumulative, and it just keeps growing and getting bigger, and the story starts getting very unwieldy very quickly. And so trying to wrangle in the story and all the characters and all the shifting points of view and all the shifting things within the character himself that he's learning about himself and the world around him. But it becomes a wrestling match, just trying to get it all to work. But I love that. I mean, that's
like you have like a variations on a theme kind of thing going, where you have that story and then you hear that melody, but you're building on it and making it richer as you go.
And for me, the more challenging, the better. I get very bored doing the same thing over and over again. I want to challenge myself with something that at some point in the story makes me feel like this is the one that's going to kill me. I want to get to that point where I feel like this is just beyond my ability to do it, and then to figure out how to make it work. And then that sense of accomplishment when you've been at the brink of failure, and then you figure out how to make it all work. I mean, that's the challenge and the exciting part of writing.
So Roseanne, within Wraith and Ruin, was there a moment you felt at the brink of what you were capable? Like you were like, this is about to break me.
The entire book, but
right?
the entire book. But honestly, right now I've been feeling it more with book 2 because this is a duology. So I've been working on the second book, and Tracy knows a little bit about this. I've been crying into her DMs for a while, but there's very much this idea that, like, honestly, we are taught, especially when it comes to fantasy, we're taught to think of fantasy in 3 is the magic number. Like, we're taught the trilogy, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, all those. Like, we think, and it makes sense. It goes back to what we're taught: the beginning, middle, of end. Even the myth arc of a series we're taught has a beginning, middle, and end. And a duology, you physically can't do that. Like, you have, it's like a 2-act structure. It's closest I've kind of like explained to people is it's kind of like trying to fit like Star Wars into like a 2-act play for Broadway. Like, you have to like pare it down, but you have to have this, you want to end up in the same place. So it's like less space, but the same place, the same emotion, evoke that. And so I have this sort of big epic world that I am trying to like sort of fit into like this smaller space. And the biggest challenge has been obviously just the book 2 woes of doing a sequel, but also the Wraith is also a dual POV. So we have 2 characters who, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read, but who are in very different places emotionally and physically at the start of book 2. And so it's one story being told in 2 different locations that has to happen, that it still has to end up at the same place. And it's just, I kind of created this logistic snarl for myself. But I think that's been like the very fun craft challenge of Wraith, is this idea of how do I take these 2 contrasting views, these 2 people who are at opposite ends of the society. Like, he's a refugee, she's a princess, literally 2 different statuses within their society. And even if the same event happens to both of them, it has to be viewed the same way, it has to be described the same way, and it has to affect them differently. I meant the opposite word there. It has to affect them differently, they have to describe it differently. And so in a lot of ways, I was kind of writing 2 books this entire time and trying to convince people it was 1 book. And so I think with Wraith, that's always been the biggest surprise. When people get to the ending, they're like, oh, this is why we needed both of them. This is why you couldn't just have one or the other. Okay. And sort of trying to pull that off again without doing the exact same thing. That's been sort of the current craft challenge I'm having here. Like, do it again, but do it better, but also do it the same. And it's like, oh, I'm not sure how to do that, but I'll figure it out.
Do any of you ever feel trapped by the structural choices you've made? So I did this epic fantasy trilogy that's behind me, with also 2 point of view characters. And there came a point where I got so mad at myself because I felt completely stuck. Each one would have about like 10,000 words, and then it would switch to the other one's experiences and point of view. And I put these interstitial chapters that were like a bird's eye view sort of thing of the society and bigger things going on. And there came a point where I was like, why did I do that? I'm now in book 3 and I have to stick with the same thing, and it's driving me nuts. But you made the choice, several books ago, and suddenly you're stuck with it. Have any of you run into choices that you structurally come to regret?
Yeah.
That were structurally challenging. Yes.
Tracy?
When I was working on the Scythe book, go on.
No, I know. I'm running into that now. I'm also working on book 2 and book 2 woes. And I think I there are some places where I'm like, wow, you made that now to do what you wanted to do in book 2 without like retconning yourself. Like, how are you going to do that? So it's like structural, but also, I like to think that my structure is very much tied to relationships quite a lot. Like, some of the emotional arc to me has to be tied to the plot. Like, I need that to be almost on top of each other. So I think I'm setting myself up for a challenge. I'm going to think about it like Neal. I'm going to be like this, like I'm pushing myself to the brink, and that's going to help me grow, and it's going to be fine. But yeah, it makes me think honestly of like reading like the Twilight series, and I think Divergent did this as well, where in the last book we got POV shifts. Do y'all remember that? How like it was like now all of a sudden we're seeing it from other people. And I remember at the time being like, oh, why'd she do that? But now as an author, I'm like, oh, I know why she did that. Because she had to do something different. And it was probably, it's both more challenging, but it allows you to do something different with the story. And so of course, like in the back of my mind, I'm like, I could always just do that. I could always decide that book 3, we're gonna do something different. And if it worked for Stephanie Meyer.
Have any of you
When I
ever
was working on the when I was working on the Scythe books, one of the things that I started with and continued the entire first book was that all the chapters were broken apart by journal entries from these, from the Scythes, who are basically, they're society ordained killers, or they go around and thin out the population. And these sections talk about how they feel about this and why it's important, and what bothers them about what they do. And so they're sort of philosophical. So I had to do one for every single chapter, and I had to make it work. And then when I got to the second book, I realized I set up the structure in the first book. What am I going to do in the second one? So I figured out a different thing. There's the Thunderhead, which is this artificial intelligence that rules the world. So all of the interstitials were musings by the Thunderhead. But then I got to the third book, and I had no idea what the interstitials were going to be, but I was stuck having to make it work. So I tried to do one structure, but it wasn't working. I tried to do a couple of different ones, and ultimately I sort of just freestyled it. I just decided that it's going to be multiple different kinds of interstitials, and yes, the interstitials will all be there, but they're not going to be uniform. And I just hoped that it worked, and I think it did.
Which brings up a thing, you create rules for yourselves, and then you realize, wait, I'm the only one making these rules. I can break them whenever I want. And this is a question from, I imagine, a teacher who is watching is, do you think it's important for students to learn these sort of standard rules that we learn of storytelling in order to be able to break them? Or do you think there's a different way we could teach structuring stories?
Well, I think personally, go ahead. I think that it is.
Oh, sorry. Why don't we do Roseanne and then Neal?
Okay.
Sorry. I do think it's important to learn that they are an option, but my problem is, and I know this is how I was taught, that I was taught it was the only option. So I think the problem becomes not necessarily you're teaching them, 3-act structure, rising action, monomyth, but when it's being presented as this is the way to do it. If you're not doing this, that is wrong. And so just always remembering to present this, that this is one way to go forward, and then also encouraging students when they're kind of when they are breaking those rules, and when they are going outside the box, and just kind of just remembering this is an entire buffet of options, and you don't have to be stuck at the little table where they have all the weird dry pizza at the buffet. You can eat the whole buffet. So I'm slightly hungry if that did not come through. But yeah, so that's right.
Neal?
I was going to say, it's with Picasso, you have to learn how to paint your eyes the way they look before you can paint two of them on one side of your face. And I think it's important to learn different structures and how things have worked in the past, and what is the simplest way to tell a story. And then once you know the building blocks, you can build things in different ways.
I'm a big fan of mentor texts, and I think I went to public school in the United States. I have a Western perspective on storytelling. That's why I was brought up that way. And even though I was getting other influences, I really value being able to break down a mentor text. If the mentor text is using that sort of familiar structure, I actually really enjoyed that. And movies are great for this as well because of the sort of save the cat structure. And I learn a lot about how people navigate those sort of traditional plot points differently. And it's always surprising when you realize that the structure might be beat by beat similar, but then you have such a different experience of that across this book and this book, or that movie and that movie. So I think it's valuable to learn just so that you become that student of structure and of possibility with all of the stories that you interact with. You can have that eye to it. And in our case, a lot of those do follow the traditional structure. But once you're there, yeah, I agree with Neal. 3 eyes on one side of the head.
Well, also, I think the way we learn stories, it privileges a particular point of view for telling stories. And I do think we need to learn other non-Western structures of story with equal emphasis. This is as valid. You might not see it as often because you're reading the books we're assigned here and watching the movies that are made here, but that it is valid and can be as compelling. And that actually brings up another audience question that I really like. Not that I didn't like all of your questions. There's just a limited amount of time. Was what's a mentor text? What's something that you structurally just blew your mind? A book specifically, but it can be YA, it can be adult, it can be a younger children's book. that you just think is structurally brilliant or that's structurally intimidating. You're like, how did they do that? I want to take this apart and figure out how they did that. I don't get it. Oh my God, that's amazing. It's pushed you. And I won't call on you. I'll let you go when you're ready, because I know whenever anyone asks me to name a book, my mind freezes. And I'm like, what is book? I've never read book before. So I'm stalling to give you time to think. But now that time has run out and it is time to answer. I saw Roseanne nod, so we'll go to you first.
Okay. This one's slightly older than the average Y'all Fest audience, but what's it called? The 5th season, N.K. Jemisin. That book is just what she does there with structure, and what she also just does with time, and like the way she uses time like as a plot point, and the way she just moves through it. I just remember reading that and I'm being like, do you ever just have a moment where you're like, this book is too smart for me? I am not smart enough to understand this. But that was me reading the 5th season, like, oh my goodness. And so I definitely like suggest, like, that is just an amazing, just an example of how you can. And in a lot of ways, though, she's so deceptively smart about it, because like when you actually read the book the first time, you look back like, and you're like just recovering from the shock. You're like, that was actually a pretty standard like hero's origin story. Like, it was pretty standard, but just the way she delivered it was so different and so genius that it felt like this huge, big, like just it's just. So that's definitely a mentor text for me there, to like what Tracy said about like how you can take things that we've seen already and just do them so differently that it feels so different.
Now, Lindsay, you mentioned the Sedgwick, right? So you have to think of it differently.
Yeah, definitely. Midwinter Blood is one of my favorites, and that is a totally weird structure. And I feel like a lot of what Marcus Sedgwick does is pretty weird structurally, and I think that's why I love it so much. Or like The Ghosts of Heaven is 4 separate stories that you can read in any order, but they're interconnected. Midwinter Blood is 7 separate stories. It's a reincarnation story, but every life is very different, and each one is a different kind of love that these people are experiencing. But it takes you until about the 3rd one to figure out what is happening, really. But he has that control of the story that you feel like you're going to find out. So that's definitely one of those that blew my mind, that I was like, wow, I don't think I can ever do something that's good. But you look back and you do see, well, yeah, there are those turns, and this made sense and that made sense. So.
Tracy?
This is such a hard question. My mind went blank, but then because we were talking about POVs, I went to Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, and I've actually just recently spoke to Rosie about this, but I didn't realize that Spinning Silver was multi-POV because Novik takes her time weaving in the POVs. And in my head, it's not so much a mentor text, because I don't know that I'll write a multi-POV. I'm scared now. Hearing Rosie talk about it, I'm scared. But the idea that your multiple POVs don't have to show up in like George R.R. Martin cyclical order, and he did this as well, right? Like you can you can have things show up when they need to be said by that person. That I don't know why, but that felt so revolutionary for some reason. And it maybe it's just I didn't know to expect it, but I remember reading it and being like, oh wow, so now I'm learning new people, and I don't know. Sometimes I think that make me really love the first POV more because I spent more time with that person and I spent less time with the other people. But no, actually, it just, for some reason, it freed me up. In my mind, you just had to like cycle through them like clockwork, and then you could tell the book. But actually, you don't need to do that. You can bring in other POVs when you need them.
All right, we've got like a minute before the hard stop on this. So Neal, real fast.
Well, a lot of the stories that blew me away and helped me develop writing were stories that I read when I was in high school and college. Kurt Vonnegut, and the way his stories will sometimes just meander and be seem like it has nothing to do with the story, and then it all sort of all comes together. I love that kind of storytelling. And now I'm having that terror of the clock ticking down. So now I can't think of anything. I have that,
it's a great example. I think all of you, the message I'm getting from all of you and all of this is that there are no rules, right? Don't be afraid to follow the rules, to break the rules you've inherited. That structure should be liberating. Yeah, they're suggestions, exactly. Use structure when you need it, disregard it when you don't. It is your story and no one else can tell it how you will. So yeah, I want to thank you all for participating in this wonderful, wonderful conversation. I'm sorry to the audience for not getting to all of your questions. We had all these fascinating authors here. I do want to remind everyone that there'll be links. You can order all of these authors' books from our bookseller, Blue Bicycle Books. Please do. That helps fund this amazing festival and keeps us going and paying for the wonderful technology that we're all using. So please order all their books. You can also order mine, but that's less important. And thank you all again for being here today. And I think with that, we're out of time. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.